Sergeant Roy Maddox slapped handcuffs on Marcus Hale, dragging him across the courtroom as if the verdict was already decided. To the crowd, Marcus looked like just another black man being publicly shamed. But in truth, he was a highly decorated Marine sniper, and a 4-star general was only seconds away from walking through those doors. What happens when arrogance meets a truth too big to hide? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let's step right into this powerful story. It was a cold autumn morning in Baltimore's Central Courthouse, the kind that seeps into your bones. The corridor opened into a bright, high-ceiling room where people whisper even when no one says, "Quiet." I found a seat near the aisle. "All rise," the bailiff called, and 100 bodies stood. Then the deputies brought him in. Marcus Hale was 38 and carried himself like a man trained to keep his chin level no matter what was stacked against him. Tall, broad shoulders. The first thing anyone noticed, though, was the steel biting his wrists. The cuffs flashed once under white lights, and the room drew a breath it didn't know what to do with. State of Maryland versus Marcus Hale. The clerk read. Charge resisting arrest. He didn't look dangerous. He looked tired in a way you can't sleep off. He sat in the defendant's chair, shoulders squared, jaw set, eyes fixed on a point just past the prosecution table. Up by the witness stand sat Sergeant Roy Maddox, 50 white, built like a wall with a badge. One leg crossed, forefinger smoothing an invisible crease, the half-smile of a man who believes the ending is already written. He leaned toward the young officer behind him. "Watch," he murmured. "This is how you keep order." Officer Daniel Cruz didn't answer. Late 20s. Latino uniform crisp, but collar tugged like it was choking him. He kept shifting his weight, eyes bouncing between the cuffs and the floor. Second row, an older woman sat straight as a post, silver hair pinned back neat as a hymn book. I would learn her name later. Mrs. Eleanor Ross. Hands on a leather purse, she watched Marcus with attention like she was waiting for a line of a song she used to know. The room ran on its own rhythm, pale light slanting through high windows, the soft crack of folders, the low hum of people deciding what they believed before they heard anything at all. In that light, the chain between Marcus's hands looked colder than the air. "Mr. Hale," the clerk said, "do you understand the charge?" "Yes, ma'am." His voice was low but steady. He didn't glance at the gallery. He didn't plead. He looked at the clerk like a man reading wind on a ridgeline. "Measure. Breathe. Do not flinch." You can feel a room take sides before it learns the facts. Shoulders tilt. Mouths purse. One bench stacks him with headlines. The other stacks him with brothers and sons who've been cuffed just as fast. Maddox raised his chin and let the smile show teeth. He'd already written his version in the report. In it, Marcus was the problem before the first word. Non-compliant. Aggressive stance. Words you can stretch over any moment until they cover exactly what you want. Cruz rubbed his thumb along the edge of his notepad like the paper might talk him into courage. When Marcus shifted, the chain clinked. Cruz flinched and cleared his throat. Maddox shot him a look that said, "Not today." Mrs. Ross eased her purse into her lap. Her hand hovered over the phone inside, then settled. She didn't nod. She didn't shake her head. She just watched. The bailiff called order again. The judge swept in, black robe whispering gavel light on wood. "Be seated." We sat. The prosecutor rose and gave the charge the shine prosecutors give it. "Your Honor, the state will show that on the afternoon of the 23rd, the defendant refused a lawful request, escalated, and resisted." He didn't look at Marcus. He looked at the jury box as if 12 empty chairs were already nodding. My eyes went back to Marcus. If you watched closely, you could see how he kept his breathing in a box. In through the nose, out through the mouth. A man can do a lot with silence if he's learned how to hold it. "Mr. Hale," the judge said, "you are represented by counsel." "Yes. Yes, Your Honor." "And you understand that anything you say may be used against you?" Yes, Your Honor. Good. Let's proceed. Maddox's smile didn't move, but his jaw did. A tiny tick, like a clock set too fast. He loved this part. The theater you can bend by saying the same words in the same tone, while a man sits in iron and tries not to become the part you cast him in. Across the aisle, Cruz blinked hard and stared at the floor until the shine on his boots went blurry. Twice he opened his mouth and shut it again. The second time his gaze lifted and landed on Mrs. Ross. She looked back like a lighthouse looks at the dark. I had seen Marcus 2 days earlier on those same steps when a gust of wind sent an old woman's papers flying. He caught 3 sheets midair and knelt to gather the rest while people flowed around them. No ceremony, no speech, just a nod. I didn't think about it again until I saw the cuffs. The judge asked the attorneys to approach. While they leaned in, the room reset itself. Coughs, chair legs, a throat cleared. Marcus didn't move. The chain didn't move. The question pressed against the windows anyway. What did he really do? When the lawyers stepped back, the judge looked over her glasses at Marcus, then at Maddox, then at the gallery that had already chosen its sides. For a heartbeat, nobody made a sound. And that's how I remember the first moments a Marine in a defendant's chair, a sergeant with a story to sell a young officer swallowing a truth that wouldn't go down, and an old woman with her phone turned face down in her purse. The light was cold. The cuffs were colder. And the next set of footsteps in that hallway was closer than anyone in that room could guess. The prosecutor stood slowly buttoning his jacket like this was a performance he'd been waiting weeks to give. His voice carried in that cool, high-ceilinged courtroom, every syllable chosen to land heavy. Your Honor, he began. The state will show that the defendant Marcus Hale engaged in aggressive behavior toward law enforcement, refused lawful orders, and posed a direct threat to public safety. The words aggressive and threat seemed to linger in the air, shaping Marcus into whatever image the listeners already held in their minds. Some in the gallery leaned forward. Others leaned back, crossing their arms. The prosecutor didn't look at Marcus. He simply lifted his hand and gestured toward the defense table like pointing alone was proof. Sergeant Roy Maddox, he said, please take the stand. Maddox rose with the confidence of a man stepping into familiar territory. The heels of his polished boots clicked against the floor. He swore and then lowered himself into the witness chair as if it belonged to him. One arm rested lazily along the side, his posture casual, but his eyes sharp. I approached Mr. Hale. On the 23rd of this month, Maddox began voice even and rehearsed. He was uncooperative. His stance was aggressive, his tone hostile. In my assessment, he posed a danger to myself and to others present. I followed protocol and acted to secure the situation. Every sentence came out clean, no stumbles, no hesitation. He painted a picture where he was the professional and Marcus the problem, calm authority versus dangerous man. I watched Marcus. Not once did he interrupt. He didn't roll his eyes or shake his head. He sat motionless, back straight, hands resting loosely on the table, eyes narrowing only when Maddox leaned on certain words, aggressive, danger, hostile. It wasn't defiance. It was the look of a man measuring just how far from the truth the story had wandered. From across the room, Officer Daniel Cruz shifted his weight. His gaze flickered toward Marcus for the briefest moment, then away just as quickly. When Maddox's eyes swept in his direction, Cruz dropped his focus to the floor, his jaw tightening. His hands stayed clasped behind his back, but I noticed one thumb pressing into the other until the knuckle went white. In the second row, Mrs. Eleanor Ross leaned forward slightly, the leather of her purse creasing under her grip. Her mouth opened just a fraction, as if she might stand and speak, but she closed it again. Her eyes stayed locked on Marcus, studying him, maybe searching for the man beneath the accusations. The room itself seemed to breathe differently now. The shuffle of papers from the clerk's desk, the faint hum of the overhead lights, even the quiet cough from somewhere in the gallery, it all felt sharper, heavier. Maddox went on adding little flourishes, a raised eyebrow. Here, a pause for effect. There. When I instructed Mr. Hale to remain still, he shifted his stance, which I perceived as preparing to resist. I had no choice but to act swiftly. No choice. That phrase hit the room like a stamp of finality. For those who'd never been in Marcus's boots, it might have sounded reasonable. For those who had, it rang with something else entirely. Marcus's attorney scribbled a note, slid it toward him. Marcus glanced down, then back up at Maddox. He didn't pick up the pen. Cruz's gaze lifted again, only to land on Mrs. Ross this time. She met his eyes, her own calm, but intent, like a lighthouse cutting through fog. The young officer swallowed, looked away. Whispers started in the far corner of the gallery, two men in work jackets murmuring to each other. I couldn't hear the words, but the tone was clear doubt. Not everyone was buying Maddox's story whole. Still, in that moment, the balance of the room leaned toward the sergeant. He had the badge, the uniform, the practiced delivery. Marcus had silence, and silence in court can be dangerous when the other side controls the narrative. Maddox's testimony wound down. In conclusion, he said my actions were in line with my duty to protect the public and my fellow officers. He looked toward the judge, then allowed his gaze to slide briefly toward Marcus, as if to say, "Checkmate." But Marcus didn't flinch. He simply blinked once, slow and deliberate, and let the silence stretch. The judge nodded toward the defense table. Cross-examination will follow. That was when I realized something. Marcus wasn't silent because he had no defense. He was silent because he was waiting for the right moment. And though most in that courtroom didn't know it yet, that moment was walking steadily toward us, step by step, just beyond the double doors. The defense attorney pressed a button on the laptop and the courtroom monitors flickered to life. "This," he said, "is the moment my client was taken into custody." The footage began in color, but with that slightly grainy texture you get from outdoor security cameras. The date stamp in this corner read 3 days earlier. Marcus was walking toward the courthouse steps wearing the same quiet focus he had today. His shoulders were squared, his hands at his sides, his pace calm. He didn't see Maddox until the sergeant stepped directly into his path. In the video, Maddox's presence filled the frame, broad chest, squared jaw, that air of authority he liked to wear like armor. Without a word of greeting, he pointed to Marcus's bag. The attorney hit pause. For the record, he said Sergeant Maddox did not present a warrant. Play resumed. Maddox unzipped the bag himself, pulling items out in full view of the people moving along the sidewalk. Papers, a folded sweatshirt, a battered notebook. Nothing dangerous, nothing illegal. On the left side of the screen, a couple slowed to watch. In the far background, Officer Daniel Cruz stood with his arms crossed, eyes flicking from Maddox's hands to Marcus's face. The audio kicked in faint but clear enough to hear Maddox's voice. "What's this?" "Where'd you get it?" Marcus's reply was steady. "It's mine, and you have no cause to—" Before he could finish, Maddox shoved the last item back into the bag and let it drop to the pavement. The attorney let it roll. That's when the moment hit. Maddox spun Marcus around, yanked his arms back, and snapped the cuffs closed with a sharp metallic bite. The sound filled the courtroom, even through the tinny speakers, a cold, final clink that made more than one person in the gallery shift in their seat. He pushed Marcus forward, forcing him to bend slightly, the chain between the cuffs glinting in the midday sun. People on the steps stopped and stared. A few pulled out their phones. In the footage, Marcus didn't fight. He didn't curse. He looked over his shoulder, once met Maddox's gaze, and said clearly enough for the mic to catch, "You're making a mistake you can't take back." The way he said it wasn't loud. It wasn't even angry. It was the kind of sentence that doesn't need volume to land. Back in the footage, Cruz took one half step forward, then stopped himself. His arms uncrossed, one hand curling into a fist at his side. His jaw tightened. He glanced toward Maddox, then away, like a man who'd just run into a wall he didn't dare climb. From the other camera angle pulled from a cell phone video, you could see Mrs. Eleanor Ross. She was standing at the edge of the crowd phone, up eyes locked on Marcus. There was nothing casual about her filming. Her expression was set, lips pressed together in a line of quiet outrage. The cell phone audio was sharper. You could hear the buzz of the crowd murmurs of, "What's going on?" and "He didn't do anything." You could also hear Maddox louder now, barking something about failure to comply as he steered Marcus toward the courthouse doors. The combination of the crowd noise, the clatter of the cuffs, and Maddox's voice made it feel less like a lawful arrest and more like a public spectacle. In the courtroom, you could feel the shift. People leaned forward. Some glanced at Marcus, maybe seeing him differently now than they had when the morning started. The video ended with Maddox pushing the door open, Marcus disappearing inside, and Mrs. Ross lowering her phone, her face unreadable, but her eyes still following. The screen went black. For a moment, the courtroom stayed silent, like everyone was processing the same thought they'd just watched a man get humiliated in broad daylight without a single piece of cause shown. And from where I sat, it was clear this wasn't just an arrest. It was a choice. A choice to strip someone of dignity in front of as many witnesses as possible. None of us, not even Maddox, knew yet how badly that choice was about to backfire. The final frame of the video was still frozen on the monitors when the sound cut through the courtroom. Not a shuffle, not the nervous steps of a latecomer. It was a march, deliberate, heavy, unapologetic. Each step landed like it was daring anyone to stand in the way. The double doors at the back swung open, and the room seemed to shrink. General Jonathan Briggs stepped inside. He wasn't just wearing a uniform, he wore authority. 4 silver stars glinted beneath the cold courtroom lights. His chest, a tapestry of medals and ribbons earned the hard way. His face was carved from stone, his eyes sharp enough to make men straighten their backs without realizing it. The whisper started in the gallery, barely audible at first. "Is that? Oh my God, that's General Briggs." But the general didn't notice, or maybe he just didn't care. His focus was locked on one man, Sergeant Roy Maddox. Briggs's boots echoed against the polished floor as he closed the distance, every step slowing the room's heartbeat. When he stopped, he was close enough that Maddox could see the faint scars at the edge of the general's jaw, a reminder this man had earned his stars in the field, not behind a desk. Sergeant Briggs said, his voice low but carrying like a command drilled into the bones of every soldier. "Uncuff my sniper." His gaze didn't waver. Now. A muscle twitched in Maddox's jaw. General, with all due respect, Briggs stepped forward, his shadow cutting across Maddox's face. "Sergeant, you've already disrespected enough today. Take them off." The smug curve on Maddox's mouth faltered. Sweat broke at his temple. His fingers hesitated at the cuffs, but he didn't dare look away. Marcus sat still, his wrists resting on his knees, eyes fixed forward. But when Briggs spoke again this time without raising his voice, there was iron in it. "You put those cuffs on the wrong man. You're making an enemy you can't afford." The key turned. The metal released with 2 sharp clicks, the sound echoing in the silence like a verdict. Marcus slowly rubbed his wrists, then finally turned his head toward Maddox, not with anger, but with a calm that somehow felt more dangerous. "I told you," he said quietly. "You're making a mistake you can't take back." From the side, Officer Cruz's eyes widened. He glanced between Marcus and the general like he'd just realized the floor under Maddox was about to give way. Mrs. Ross, still seated in the gallery, allowed herself the smallest knowing smile, her eyes glinting with the satisfaction of seeing arrogance meet its match. The entire room felt different now. The predator was no longer on the hunt. The hunter had just walked in, and he wasn't asking for permission. And from where I sat, it was clear whatever Maddox thought he controlled that illusion had just shattered. The silence that followed General Briggs's command still clung to the air like static. The judge, a silver-haired man with sharp eyes, adjusted his glasses and leaned forward slightly. "General Briggs," He began, his voice carrying both authority and curiosity. "Would you care to explain your connection to the defendant?" Briggs didn't look at the judge at first. His eyes stayed locked on Maddox for a beat too long, like he was deciding whether the man in front of him was worth speaking to at all. Then slowly, he turned to the bench. "He's not just the defendant," Briggs said, his voice low but steady enough to command the entire room. "He's one of the finest Marines I've ever served with. Decorated, respected, a man who's risked more for this country than most in this room will ever understand." The words hung there heavy, drawing the courtroom into an almost reverent hush. From his seat at the prosecution table, Maddox shifted uncomfortably. His jaw tightened, but the confidence in his eyes had thinned. He shot a glance at Marcus, not the sneering superior look from earlier, but something with an edge of calculation. And maybe fear. Marcus didn't return the look. He sat as he had all morning, hands resting calmly in front of him, gaze steady ahead. The only flicker of reaction came in the subtle lift of his chin, like the weight pressing down on him had lightened just a fraction. Behind Maddox, Officer Cruz's expression wavered. You could almost see the war being fought inside him, loyalty to his badge, loyalty to his partner, versus the truth he'd witnessed. If he spoke up now, he'd be crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. His fingers flexed once, then tightened into fists against his knees. On the defense bench, Mrs. Ross leaned forward slightly, her phone in hand. She wasn't scrolling. She was sending the video she'd recorded days earlier straight to Marcus's attorney. Her eyes never left Maddox as she hit send, her expression cool and deliberate, like she'd just loaded a bullet into the chamber. The tension in the room was alive now, moving like a current. People in the gallery began whispering to each other, low murmurs at first, then slightly bolder. A man in the back leaned toward his neighbor, his voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear, "If that's true, this whole thing's a sham." The judge rapped his gavel once for order, but even he didn't seem immune to the shift. His gaze flicked between Briggs and Marcus with something new in it. Not warmth exactly, but no longer the dismissive distance from before. Maddox cleared his throat, straightening his tie as though adjusting the fabric could somehow straighten the crumbling narrative he'd built. But it was clear a crack had formed and everyone could see it. In that moment you could feel it. The balance of power was no longer fixed. Briggs's words had landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples outward, reaching every corner of the courtroom. And Marcus remained silent. But his silence didn't feel like submission anymore. It felt like a man waiting for the truth to do what it always does surface. No one knew it yet, but this was the moment the trial stopped being about a single accusation and started becoming something much bigger. The judge's voice was firm. "Proceed." Marcus's attorney rose slowly, almost savoring the moment. "Your Honor, we have something the court hasn't seen. Footage. Captured by a witness right here in this room." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Mrs. Ross shifted forward in her seat, her hands steady as she passed her phone to the clerk. The lights dimmed slightly and the large courtroom screen flickered to life. The video began. Marcus stood at the courthouse entrance days earlier, calm hands visible, just waiting to enter. No sign of hostility, no raised voice. Then Maddox entered the frame, striding toward him with the swagger of a man convinced he couldn't be questioned. He stepped right into Marcus's path chest, out jaw set. The sound picked up Maddox's voice, sharp, commanding. "Bag, now." Marcus's reply was measured. "Is there a reason, officer?" No answer. Maddox shoved Marcus back a step, yanked the backpack off his shoulder, and began rummaging through it like he owned it. No warrant, no explanation, just authority raw and unchecked. Then, the cuffs. The metallic snap was loud enough to make the gallery flinch. Maddox forced Marcus to bend forward, pressing him toward the hood of a nearby car as people on the sidewalk stopped to watch. That was when Marcus's voice came steady, cutting through the tension like a blade. "You're making a mistake. You can't take back. The footage ended. Silence followed. It was the kind of silence that felt heavier than any gavel strike. Then, a single scrape of wood on tile. Officer Cruz stood. His face was pale, but his jaw was locked. Your Honor. He began glancing briefly at Marcus before fixing his gaze on the judge. I was there. I saw it all. Maddox's head whipped toward him. Cruz, sit down. Enough. The judge barked his gavel, slamming once. He will speak. Cruz swallowed hard, voice tightening. Marcus didn't resist. He didn't shout. He asked one question, and Maddox ignored him. We had no reason none to stop him. I knew it then, and I stayed quiet. That was wrong. I won't stay quiet now. Gasps and whispers filled the room. A woman in the back whispered, God bless him, while another man shook his head in disbelief. Maddox's face burned crimson, his hands curling into fists under the table. At the defense bench, Marcus still didn't move, but his eyes found Cruz's, holding them for a moment as if silently saying, I heard you. From his seat, General Briggs leaned forward just slightly, the weight of his stare locked on Maddox. That look said more than words ever could. When Cruz sat down, the applause began tentative at first, then building until the judge's gavel brought it back to order. Maddox kept his eyes locked on the bench, refusing to look at anyone. But the shift had happened, and everyone in the room felt it. Marcus's silence now carried a different weight, not that of a man under siege, but of someone who knew the battle was turning. And for the first time, the faintest curve touched the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, but the shadow of one. Victory wasn't his yet, but the ground beneath Maddox had cracked. You could feel the air shift when General Briggs finally moved from the back of the courtroom. His boots tapped steadily against the floor, measured deliberate each step, drawing the room's attention like a magnet. He carried a thick binder in one hand, the kind you knew didn't just hold paper, but weight. When he reached the prosecution's table, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Your Honor, Briggs, said, his tone steady but cutting through the tension like a blade. I have here federal records verified, signed and sealed, linking Officer Maddox to a pattern of unlawful force abuse of authority and in one instance falsifying evidence to secure a conviction. The words landed heavy. Maddox's jaw tightened. He tried to scoff, to wave it off. This is nonsense, he snapped, pounding the table. I've served this city, for Briggs flipped the binder open with a crisp motion. Page 13. The incident on 5th Street. You remember it. The victim's testimony didn't match your report yet. Your signature is here. He tapped the page. That signature is yours, isn't it? Maddox's voice cracked. It's taken out of context. Context, Briggs replied. His eyes locking onto Maddox is what you lose when the facts are staring you in the face. A murmur rippled through the gallery. A couple of uniformed officers exchanged glances, their faces pale. Without a word, two of them slipped quietly out the side door. They weren't going to be collateral damage in whatever storm was about to hit Maddox. Across the aisle, Marcus remained seated, hands folded loosely in his lap. His face was calm, but his eyes, sharp and unyielding, followed every beat. The smallest shift in his posture, the faint lift of his chin, carried the silent message. The tide has turned. Maddox lunged again. This man has no authority here. He has all the authority he needs. The judge interrupted her gavel rapping once. You will remain silent while the evidence is reviewed. The tension snapped tighter when a burly officer in the back took a step toward Cruz, muttering something low and threatening under his breath. Briggs was on him in 2 strides. Touch him, Briggs said, voice cold as granite, and I'll make sure your career ends before the sun goes down. The officer froze, then backed off, muttering nothing more. Cruz exhaled slowly, nodding in quiet thanks before focusing back on the stand. Briggs kept going. He laid out incident after incident, dates, locations, victims, each backed by irrefutable documentation. Maddox's denials grew weaker. his shoulders rounding under the weight of what was no longer accusation, but proof. By the time Briggs closed the binder, the room was silent, except for the faint rustle of someone shifting in the gallery. The judge leaned forward, her eyes on Maddox. "These allegations warrant immediate federal investigation," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Effective today, Officer Maddox is relieved of duty pending the outcome of that inquiry." The words ignited the room. Applause broke out. Not the polite kind, but sharp, relieved claps from people who had waited far too long to see someone like Maddox held accountable. In the second row, Mrs. Ross allowed herself the smallest of smiles. She didn't need to say a word. Her eyes said it all. Justice wasn't just an idea anymore. It was here in this room, in this moment. Marcus finally looked up at Briggs, their eyes meeting for a split second. No nod, no smile, just a shared understanding between two men who had faced worse than this and still walked out standing. And though the clapping faded, the energy lingered like everyone in that room knew they had just witnessed the crack in a wall they'd been told would never break. They had to drag Maddox out. His protests faded down the hallway, swallowed by the slam of the heavy double doors. The room was still buzzing from the judge's order, but Briggs didn't waste time. He turned to Marcus, his voice low enough that only a few of us nearby could hear. "Marcus, he said you have every right to press charges against Maddox against the entire department if you want. I'll back you all the way." Marcus didn't answer right away. He sat there for a moment, hands clasped loosely in front of him, eyes fixed on some point beyond the courtroom walls. You could almost hear the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. Then he looked up at Briggs and his voice was calm, steady in a way that cut through all the leftover noise. "I don't want revenge," Marcus said. "I want change." It wasn't loud, but everyone near enough to hear it froze for a second. Those words didn't sound like a man letting someone off the hook. They sounded like someone aiming higher than the walls of this courtroom. Briggs straightened. "Change takes time," he said, almost testing Marcus's resolve. "Then we start now," Marcus replied. "You've seen it too many young officers come in thinking the badge makes them untouchable. We need to change that before it ever takes root. I want a program mandatory for every rookie. Ethics accountability. Real training that makes them understand who they're serving." There was no fire in his tone, no grandstanding, just conviction solid and unshakable. Briggs let out a slow breath, the kind you take when you know the road ahead won't be easy, but you're already committed. "You'll have it," he said. "Every resource I can pull. Instructors funding whatever it takes, we'll build it from the ground up." From the back of the room, Cruz stepped forward. The man who had risked his career moments ago now moved with the same quiet certainty Marcus had just shown. He didn't speak right away. He just extended his hand. Marcus stood and the two men shook hands. It wasn't just a handshake. It was an exchange of something unspoken. Cruz's eyes held gratitude, but also a kind of acceptance. Marcus gave a small nod like he was silently acknowledging the cost of what Cruz had done. The room around them stayed silent for that beat. No applause, no murmurs, just the quiet understanding that sometimes the most important battles aren't won by shouting, but by deciding what comes next. Briggs watched them both, then glanced at the judge who had been observing in silence. Even she seemed to recognize this moment for what it was, a passing of responsibility from one set of shoulders to another. And just like that, the noise started to creep back in the shuffle of papers, the scrape of chairs, but for those who had seen it, that brief silence would stick. It was the kind of pause that lives in memory long after the sound returns. The heavy courtroom doors swung shut behind them, and for the first time all day the air felt lighter. Afternoon light poured through the tall windows lining the hallway, catching the dust in soft golden strands. Marcus walked a step ahead, his posture steady, the kind of steady that comes from carrying something heavy and deciding you won't let it break you. Cruz caught up to him near the marble column. He hesitated just enough to show this wasn't easy before Marcus turned to face him. Their eyes met, and Marcus spoke quietly, the kind of quiet that demands you listen. "Do better," he said. "They'll follow you." It wasn't a lecture. It wasn't a plea. It was a charge, a responsibility handed from one man to another. Cruz nodded once, jaw tight. You could see the words land somewhere deep, where excuses can't reach. Briggs stood a few steps away, leaning against the wall with his arms folded, watching them both. There was no mistaking the pride in his eyes, not the kind you get from winning a fight, but from seeing someone choose the harder road because it's right. That's when Mrs. Ross stepped forward. She'd been quiet through most of the walk, her phone still in hand, the same phone that had captured the truth when it mattered most. "My nephew." She began, her voice steady but lined with something older, was killed by an officer 10 years ago. No charges. No apology. Nothing. Marcus turned fully toward her, his expression shifting softer now but more guarded. "I saw what they tried to do to you today," she continued. "And I saw what you did instead. That matters. More than you know." The hallway seemed to still again. Even Briggs glanced at the floor, giving the moment space. Marcus reached for her hand, his grip firm but warm. "We all deserve better," he said. Just 4 words, but they carried the weight of her loss, his resolve, and something bigger than both of them. Mrs. Ross didn't speak right away. She just nodded as if those words fit into a space she'd been holding open for years. And then they started walking, Marcus in the middle, Briggs on one side. Mrs. Ross on the other, Cruz falling in just behind. It wasn't a parade, no one was clapping, but there was something about the image of them moving together down that long corridor, black, white, uniform, civilian, that made you realize you were seeing something rare. Not victory, not an ending, but the beginning of a kind of alliance that doesn't need signatures or speeches. When they reached the courthouse steps, the late sun caught their faces, and for a moment, the light made it impossible to tell where one shadow ended and another began. They didn't look back. The doors opened with a low groan, and Marcus stepped out into the fading light. The marble steps still held the day's heat, but the air was softer now, touched with the gold of an early evening sun. He paused halfway down, just watching. People moved past on the sidewalk, lawyers with their briefcases, mothers hurrying their kids along, a street vendor calling out the last of his pretzels. Life was going on as if the storm inside that courthouse hadn't even happened. For a long moment, he just stood there. No rush, no words. You could almost see the weight shifting on his shoulders, not gone but lighter. Then Briggs came up beside him, the brim of his cap casting a shadow across his eyes. He didn't say much, just rested a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "The fight's not over," Briggs said, his voice steady, almost like a promise. "But you made a damn good start." Marcus let out a small laugh, not the kind that comes from amusement, but the kind that slips out when you know the truth in what you've just heard. He gave a single nod, then started down the steps, each stride measured. From the landing, Cruz stood with Mrs. Ross. They didn't speak, but their faces said enough relief, pride, and something deeper. Hope. The kind you don't always find in courtrooms. Mrs. Ross held her phone at her side, now the screen dark, but her fingers still curled around it like she understood the weight of what it had done. Cruz's gaze followed Marcus, as if willing himself to remember that moment, the one where standing up had felt like standing alone and then hadn't. Marcus reached the bottom step. The noise of the street folded around him. Car horns, the rumble of a bus, the low hum of the city finding its rhythm again. He didn't look back. In his hand, half hidden from anyone watching, was an old military ID. The edges were worn smooth, the photograph faded. He tightened his grip on it, not as a weapon, not as proof, but as a reminder of where he'd been, what he'd stood for, and the dignity no one could take from him. And then, without ceremony, without applause, he walked into the crowd. The late sun stretched his shadow long across the pavement until it disappeared into the rhythm of the city. Somewhere behind him, the courthouse loomed still, holding its echoes. But Marcus was already moving toward whatever came next. Stories like this remind us that justice isn't just about laws, it's about people, dignity, and the courage to choose what's right even when it's hard. If this story moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories for more powerful tales that shed light on truth and humanity. Your support means more than you know. It fuels our passion and keeps our team creating stories that matter. Let Mr. Mac's Stories be that voice you remember when the world needs reminding. Respect and justice belong to everyone,